Earth was banned by the Galactic Council, so humanity broke the galaxy. The vote was already over by the time walked into the chamber. I knew it the moment I saw the light. Above the council floor, it was red. Deep, steady red, like a wound that had stopped bleeding only because everything around it had gone cold. 4,000 member species represented in that hall, and not one of them had voted to keep us. My name is Yara Osai. I am commander of the Unobserver vessel Tenacity, and on the morning of March 14th, 2187, I had the honor of watching the galaxy tell 8 billion humans to get out. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I stood in my observer's booth on the upper tier of the Galactic Council, Chamber 40M above the council floor, and I watched the High Arbiter read the verdict into the translation network that connected every inhabited star system within 1,200 light years. The High Arbiter's name was unpronounceable in any human language, so we called him Arbiter Veth. He was of Vreth, 7-limbed, pale silver, with 4 eyes arranged in a wide arc across a face that never smiled, because Vreth faces simply could not. His voice came through the translation earpiece as a calm, measured baritone, the way a machine reads a death notice. The Galactic Council, he said, having reviewed the full record of Earth's provisional membership dating from the year 2147, hereby issues the following determination. Earth and all human-administered territories are found to be in systemic violation of Council Directive 9 on unauthorized faster-than-light testing. In protected stellar regions, Council Directive 44 on cross-species genetic intervention without the consent of the recipient species, and Council Directive 71, 72, and 73, which constitute the formal warning framework issued across the years 2179, 2182, and 2185. Earth ignored all three. In light of this record, the Council votes to suspend Earth's provisional membership indefinitely and to issue a full exclusion order effective immediately. All human vessels are required to vacate Council-registered space within 72 hours. All trade, communication, and transit rights are revoked. He paused. The Council thanks Earth for its 40 years of provisional participation. That was it. 40 years, 8 billion people. A whole species thanked and discarded, like a guest who had stayed too long and broken too much furniture. I pressed my palm against the railing of the observer booth to steady myself, not from grief but from something sharper, something that sat behind my sternum and pressed outward like a held breath. I had read the charges before they were read aloud. I knew they were true. I also knew that the Council had known about most of these violations for years, and had chosen this moment, this specific political moment, when 3 of the 5 dominant Council species were facing internal pressure to finally act. This was not justice, this was convenience wearing justice's clothes. But I did not say that. I was in observer's watch. The Council gallery was packed, species I recognized and species I could not name filled every tier above the floor. Some in atmosphere suits, some in tanks, some standing on 4 legs or 6, or none at all, suspended in the air by technology I had never been cleared to examine. They were all watching the human booth, watching me. I straightened my back. I kept my face still. I had been trained for this, not for the specific moment of a galactic Expulsion, but for the principle. Underneath it, never let them see what they have actually done to you, not because you are hiding pain, but because what you feel is too large for their framework, and showing it would only confuse them. My communications officer, Lieutenant Cole Warren, was standing 2 m behind me. He was 26 years old, had been in space for 4 years, and I heard him exhale slowly through his nose as the red light held steady above the floor. He did not say a word. I appreciated that more than I could express. The Arbiter Veth descended from his raised platform and crossed the chamber floor toward the human booth. This was unusual. Verdicts were delivered from the platform. Arbiters did not walk to the condemned, but he came anyway, and when he reached the transparent barrier between the chamber floor and the observer booths, he activated his personal comms channel and spoke only to my earpiece. "Commander Asa," he said, "we expected something different from your species." "What did you expect?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Distress," he said, "argument perhaps. A formal objection on procedural grounds. Humans are vocal when they are afraid." "We are," I said, "but we are not afraid right now." He tilted his head, which was a Vreth gesture meaning something between curiosity and confusion. "Then what are you?" I looked at him through the transparent barrier behind me. I could feel Cole holding very still. "We are calculating," I said. The Arbiter's 4 eyes held on me for a long moment, then he nodded once and walked away. I turned to Cole. He raised an eyebrow. "Calculating what exactly?" he asked. Quietly. "Everything," I said. "Pull up a secure channel to Earth Command and get Dr. Made up from the lab deck. I need her opinion on something before we leave orbit." Cole moved immediately, his fingers already at his earpiece. I turned back to the chamber and watched the council members filing out in their various ways, sliding, floating, walking, rolling, all of them already moving on to the next agenda item, the next policy, the next species to manage or dismiss or contain. That was what they had never understood about us, I thought. They watched us for 40 years, and they recorded our violations, and they issued their warnings, and they assumed that because we responded to those warnings with formal letters of acknowledgement, we were being managed. We were not being managed. We were being patient. On the ride back to the Tenacity, I sat in the shuttle bay and opened the message that had arrived from Earth Command 14 minutes ago, time to arrive. Just after the vote. It was short. It was from Director Alan Ford, the head of the UN Space Agency, a man I had known for 11 years. He had terrible handwriting when he wrote by hand, but his typed messages were always precise. The message said, "Yara, the 72 hours. Start now, don't waste any of them." I smiled for the first time since I had walked into that chamber. 72 hours. The council had given us 72 hours to vacate their space. They thought they were giving us a deadline. They had given us a head start. Dr. Priya met me in the corridor outside the bridge before I even reached the door. She was 41 years old, originally from Bangalore, with close-cropped hair and a habit of talking with her hands that she had never managed to stop even in zero gravity, which occasionally sent her spinning into bulkheads. She was the finest xenobiologist I had ever met, and she had been on board the Tenacity for 3 years specifically because she was working on a project the council had expressly told her to stop. She had not stopped. You saw the vote, I said. It was not a question. I saw it, she said. Are we doing this? We were always doing this, I said. How long do you need? She looked at the ceiling the way she did when she was running numbers in her head. 40 hours, she said, maybe 38 if Cole gives me the secondary array. Cole, I said. Already on it, he called from the bridge. I looked at Priya, she looked at me. We had had this conversation before in different forms in different places. Across 3 years of careful and technically illegal work, and both of us understood what it meant now that the last reason for restraint had been removed. 38 hours, I said. Then we finish what we started. She nodded and turned back toward the lab deck without another word. I stepped onto the bridge and stood at the forward viewport, looking out at the council station hanging in the dark. It was enormous and old and covered in the lights of 4,000 civilizations, and it had just made a very serious mistake. It had stopped being the thing we were trying to impress, which meant it had stopped being the thing that limited us. The tenacity turned away from the station, and I watched the council's lights shrink behind us. 72 hours, somewhere back on Earth, in labs and shipyards and quiet offices. With no windows, 8 billion people were not crying, not arguing, not afraid. They were calculating. And we had already done most of the math. The first thing we did was stop pretending. That is the most honest way I can put it. For 40 years, humanity had existed inside a performance. We showed the council the parts of ourselves they found acceptable, the diplomats, the trade agreements, the formal requests submitted in triplicate, the polite letters acknowledging warnings we had no intention of following. We dressed our ambitions in careful language and kept the dangerous work tucked quietly behind classified doors. The moment that red light went solid above the council floor, the performance ended. I did not give a speech about it. I did not call the crew together and explain the gravity of the moment, the tenacity. Had 41 people aboard, and every single one of them understood within the first 20 minutes what this meant, because they were all the kind of people who had accepted postings on a ship where the chief scientist was running experiments the council had specifically prohibited. They had signed up knowing the job was bigger than what the paperwork said. What followed across those 72 hours was the most productive period of my entire career. Within the first 6 hours, I received confirmation from Earth Command that Operation Relay was going live. This was something I had known about in broad outline but had never seen in detail, because the detail was genuinely startling. Over the previous 11 years, while every council inspection team was focused on our declared infrastructure, our registered shipyards, our official communication relays, our formal trading posts, a separate, entirely undeclared network had been under quiet construction in the unmapped void. Corridors between star systems. 14 relay stations, each one built in a region of space that fell outside every boundary the council had ever formally registered, not hidden exactly, just located somewhere no one had thought to look, because no one else had thought. Those corridors were worth anything. They were worth everything. The moment Operation Relay went active, humanity had its own communication network, faster than anything the Council operated in those corridors, completely outside Council jurisdiction, and already preloaded with the contact codes of 67 non-Council species who had been quietly invited to tune in. Director Ford's team had been building a guest list for years. While the relay network came online, I was dealing with the second item on my own list, which required a call to a species most of the Council had spent 3 centuries ignoring. The Kelari lived on a moon in the outer reach, a cold and dim place with thin atmosphere and a slow orbit that gave them a year lasting 900 Earth days. They were small, gray-skinned, with large, dark eyes and hands built for delicate work. The Council had classified them as non-sentient in the year 1890, one of the galactic calendar, based on an assessment conducted by a HFY survey team that had spent 4 days on the moon, failed to understand any of the Kelari's communication system and concluded the species was therefore not communicating. This was the xenobiological equivalent of visiting a library, failing to read the books and deciding no one in the building was literate. Priya had known the truth for 6 years. The Kelari were not only sentient but were operating a sophisticated culture built around acoustic and tactile language that no Council survey team had been equipped to detect. She had spent 3 of those 6 years learning enough of their language to hold basic conversations, and 2 more years working on something the Council had formally told her to cease. The Uplift Protocol. Uplift in Council terminology meant the sharing of advanced technology or biological enhancement with a developing species without going through the Council's 40-step approval process, which took an average of 60 years and required the developing species to meet 17 criteria that had been written specifically to favor the biology and cognition of the 5 dominant Council species. The Kelari failed 4 of those criteria, not because they were behind but because the criteria were not designed with them in mind. Priya's protocol bypassed the process entirely. It did not introduce foreign biology. It worked with what the Kelari already had, amplified what was already present, and gave their natural communication abilities the kind of range and clarity that would allow them to speak to the wider galaxy without an intermediary. I authorized her to complete the work at hour 9 of the 72. By hour 23, the Kelari were speaking for themselves for the first time in recorded galactic history. The Council heard about it at hour 26 from a sensor relay that picked up the Kelari transmitting on a frequency they had never used before. By that point, 3 independent systems, none of them Council members, had already responded to the transmission, recognized the Kelari as people they wanted to know, and formally acknowledged their existence as a sovereign species. The Council could not object. They had never ratified Kelari sovereignty, which meant they had no legal standing to tell 3 independent systems who they could or could not recognize. This was not an accident. Priya and I had mapped this legal gap 4 years ago. Meanwhile, Cole was running the second half of what I was starting to think of as the 72-hour sprint. On the engineering deck, 2 levels below the bridge, a team of 5 had been living next to a drive prototype they had kept deliberately, carefully, strategically unfinished for the past decade. I want to be precise about that word. Strategically. The prototype used a fold space compression method that, when complete, would allow a ship to cross distances in hours that currently took weeks on Council standard drives. It was, without question, the most significant piece of human engineering since the first generation of FTL travel, and for 10 years through 4 separate Council inspection cycles it had remained at roughly 60 to 65% of completion. Not because we lacked the parts, not because we lacked the expertise, but because a completed fold drive would have triggered an immediate Council inspection under Directive 9, the same directive we had already been cited for violating with our test runs in the Northern Nebula Corridor. A completed drive was evidence, an unfinished prototype was just a very ambitious research project. The inspectors had walked past it every time, made their notes, and left. At hour 11, I authorized the engineering team to finish what they had started 10 years ago. At hour 61, the drive was complete. We ran the first full test at hour 63, with the tenacity positioned at the outermost edge of the Council's registered jurisdiction. Cole counted down from 10. The drive engaged stars outside the forward viewport did something I do not have adequate language to describe. They did not blur or stretch the way old science fiction had always promised. They simply rearranged. One moment we were at the Council border. The next moment we were 38 light hours away in empty space with nothing around us but dark and distance and our own quiet breathing. No one said anything for about 4 seconds. Then Priya from the lab deck over the internal comm said, "Well, that worked." The laughter that moved through the bridge was not the polished, controlled kind. It was the kind that comes out when something you have carried for a very long time is suddenly, finally no longer a weight but a wing. I allowed it to run for 30 seconds, then I called everyone back to station. We still had 9 hours remaining on the Council's countdown clock. I spent 6 of those hours on the secure comm line with Director Ford and a group of people I had only ever spoken to in theory, the heads of 12 human outpost operations located in unclaimed deep space. These were not glamorous postings. They were cold, far difficult places staffed by people who had agreed to spend years away from everything familiar in exchange for the chance to do work that no one was watching. They had used that freedom well. Across those 12 outposts, over the previous 11 years, the equivalent of a small secondary civilization had been quietly assembled. Food production systems that did not depend on Council trade routes, manufacturing capacity for ship components, medical research that had been deemed too aggressive for Council standards, communication, encryption that no Council system had the architecture to break. None of this was on any official manifest. None of it had ever been inspected. It existed in the margins of a galaxy that had spent 4 decades watching our front door and never once checked what we were building in the back. Director Ford's message at the end of that call was direct. "We are not isolated," he said. "We were never isolated. We just needed a reason to stop pretending we were contained." The countdown reached 0 at 300 ship time. I was in my chair on the bridge drinking coffee that had gone cold, watching the sensor display that showed the Council's patrol vessels positioned along what they believed was the boundary of human accessible space. They were watching for an evacuation. They saw nothing move, because we did not leave council space. In the way they expected, we left using a drive they did not know we had, through corridors they had not mapped, toward a network they had not detected, to meet people they had not considered. We did not flee. We expanded. And somewhere in the vast, miscalculated dark, the Galactic Council began to understand slowly, then all at once, that the 72 hours they had granted us, out of procedure and mild contempt, had been the most expensive gift they had ever given. They had given humanity permission to stop asking permission, and we had used every single second. 6 months, that is how long it took for the word fracture to stop being a metaphor and start being a map. I was aboard a ship that did not exist. On any council registry, we called her the Rift Walker, a name that had started as an engineering joke about the fold drive and stayed because nothing more accurate came along. She was fast in a way that no other ship in the galaxy currently was, and she was mine. And on a cold morning in September of 2187, I was sitting in the captain's seat, watching a star chart that looked nothing like the one I had grown up studying. The council's map of the galaxy was a network of approved lanes, registered systems, and color-coded zones of jurisdiction that had taken 3 centuries to draw and was taught to every species that applied for membership as though it were a fact of nature rather than a political agreement. I had learned it in school. I had filed transit applications through it for 15 years. It had felt for a very long time like the shape of reality itself. The map on my screen was different. It had no lanes, no zones, no colors assigned by committee. It had nodes, connection points where a ship with a fold drive could emerge, dock, trade, or simply exist without anyone checking credentials. It had lines between those nodes that represented relationships rather than permissions. It was growing at a rate that still surprised me every time I looked at it, because I kept forgetting how many species had been waiting quietly for exactly this kind of opening. 43 at last count, 43 non-council, non-human species that had begun making contact with us in the 6 months since the ban, not because they loved humanity in particular, but because we had done something none of them had managed. We had cracked the council's grip on deep space transit, and we had immediately given the key away. The fold drive schematics had not been classified, locked, or sold. They had been shared freely through the relay network in every language we had translation capacity for, with a cover note from Director Ford that said, "Simply build this and go where you want, no fee, no treaty required." The council had spent centuries controlling who could go where by controlling transit technology. We had ended that monopoly in one broadcast. The fallout was still spreading. I was thinking about this when Lieutenant Cole Warren appeared in the doorway behind me. He had a look I recognized, the carefully neutral expression he used when he had information he was not sure I would enjoy. "Message from the relay network," he said. "Priority tier." "Who from?" "Vreth Diplomatic Office," he said. "Private channel, they're asking for a meeting." I turned my chair to face him fully. "The Vreth Arbiter Vreth himself," Cole said. "He wants it unofficial, no council record." He used the phrase "off the books," which I think is the first time I have ever Heard a Vreth use human slang. I was quiet for a moment. The Vreth had been among the loudest voices for the ban. Vreth had personally delivered the verdict, and now 6 months later he was asking for a private conversation using the exact communication network the council had no access to. Tell him yes, I said. Tomorrow 1400. Ship time, and tell him to come alone. Cole nodded and left. I turned back to the star chart. The Vreth were intelligent enough to read what was happening. The council's trade income had dropped by nearly 18% in 6 months because 43 species had quietly shifted at least some of their commerce to routes the council did not control and therefore could not tax. It was not a collapse, not yet, but it was a leak, and it was getting larger, and the Vreth were nothing if not gifted at reading financial currents. The next morning, I was also dealing with something that required my full attention for reasons that had nothing to do with politics. Priya had called me to the lab deck at 700, which she only did when something had changed significantly. I found her standing over a communication terminal with her arms crossed, watching a data stream with an expression that could only be described as satisfied. The Kalari, she said without preamble. What about them? They filed, she said, yesterday, through the new relay network using the communication protocols we helped them develop. They filed for formal species recognition with the independent systems assembly. That's the loose coalition. The 3 systems that first recognized them have been forming. The council cannot block that, I said. The council has no standing to try. She said they never ratified Kalari sovereignty, which means they have no legal basis to contest any recognition the assembly grants. She paused, and the Kalari have formally requested that humanity serve as their technology liaison. I looked at her. They know what they're asking, she said. They're fully aware. I made very sure they understood everything before they filed. They want the relationship. They want access to what we are building. And what do we ask in return? I said. They have offered a permanent port, Priya said, on their moon, fully outside council jurisdiction, fully supplied with landing rights for any vessel flagged under the new relay network. A port, a physical permanent operational port in a location the council had no authority over and had spent centuries disregarding because they thought nothing worth docking there lived on that cold little moon. I thought about the council's star map, with its careful lanes and its color-coded zones. Except, I said. Priya allowed herself a small smile, which for her was the equivalent of a standing ovation. That afternoon I met Arbiter Veth. He arrived via private shuttle that did not carry council markings, a detail that told me everything about how seriously he was taking the unofficial nature of the meeting. He was smaller than I remembered from the chamber, or perhaps it was simply that the chamber had made everything larger through formality. He sat across the small table in the Rift Walker's meeting room and folded 6 of his 7 limbs in the Vreth posture that my translation files identified as cautious openness. Commander Asa, he said, I appreciate your willingness to meet. You came a long way, I said. I assumed you had something worth saying. I do, he said. I want you to understand that I voted for the ban. I know, I said. I watched you. I want you to understand why, he said. Not to justify it, to explain it. There is a difference. I waited. The council exists, he said, because 400 years ago the galaxy was in a state that your historians would probably describe as chaos. 37 active territorial disputes, 11 species on the edge of collapse from resource competition, 2 wars that had been running for over a century with no clear end. The council was built to stop all of that, and it did. For 300 years it has maintained a peace that nothing before it managed. I know the history, I said. Then you know that the price of that peace was structure, he said, rules, hierarchies, approved processes. The council does not fear humanity because you are violent. You are actually statistically less prone to organized conflict than 14 other member species. The council fears humanity because you do not respect the structure, you do not follow approved processes, you move too fast and you share too freely, and you ignore the careful balance the structure maintains. The structure, I said carefully, maintains the power of the 5 dominant species. It does not maintain balance. It maintains a particular outcome. Veth's eyes shifted in the way Vreth's eyes shifted when something registered as accurate but unwelcome. Yes, he said after a pause, that is also true. The honesty surprised me. I had expected deflection. What do you want, Arbiter? I said. I want, he said, to know whether there is a version of what you are building that does not require the council to fall. I considered my answer for several seconds. I had thought about this. I had thought about it long before the ban, and harder in the 6 months since. There is, I said, but it requires the council to change in ways that its dominant members will find deeply uncomfortable. Tell me, he said. The new network we are building, I said, does not ban anyone. It does not exclude any species, not even the ones currently running the council, but it has no internal hierarchy, no species controls the transit lanes, no species taxes commerce. Every member, regardless of size or age or technology level, has the same standing. If the council or former council members want to join that network, the door is open. And if they do not, Veth asked, then they remain where they are, I said, and the rest of the galaxy moves forward without them. He was quiet for a long time. The ship hummed around us. That is not a compromise, he said. Finally, that is a replacement. It is an invitation, I said, which is more than the council offered us. Veth rose, refolding his limbs, and looked at me with the expression I was beginning to recognize as his particular variety of reluctant respect. I will think about what you have said, he said. Take your time, I said. We are not going anywhere. He left. I sat alone in the meeting room for a moment and looked at the star chart on the wall, the new one, the one without lanes or zones, the one that was still growing. The council had built its power over 3 centuries, carefully, methodically, through 1,000 small agreements and 1,000 small exclusions and 1,000 small moments where a developing species asked for help and was told to wait, to apply, to qualify, to come back in 60 years when the paperwork cleared. We had been building our answer for 11 years, and we had only just begun. The fracture was not a single crack in a single place. It was 1,000 lines running in every direction through a structure that had mistaken its own aim for strength. Old things are not strong because they are old, they are simply old, and the galaxy, I was beginning to understand, had been waiting a very long time for someone to point that out clearly enough to be heard. We were being heard now, and the lines were still spreading. 18 months after the ban, and I had not slept more than 5 hours in 3 days. I want to be straightforward about that, because everything that happened in those days was shaped by the specific kind of clarity that arrives when exhaustion burns away everything except what actually matters. The Council's compliance fleet had been assembling for 6 weeks. I had been watching the sensor reports come in through the relay network, ship by ship, class by class, the slow construction of the largest military mobilization the Galactic Council had authorized in 300 years, 600 warships. The fleet admiral was a Krethwar named, something I rendered in my notes as a series of clicks that my translation software gave up on. So I simply called her the Admiral. She was experienced, highly decorated, and she had spent 40 years operating within a military doctrine built around one central assumption: an enemy that is cornered will eventually stand still and fight. We were not cornered, and we were not going to stand still. I was in the command center of Relay Station Delta, one of the 14 void corridor stations that formed the backbone of our independent network when the fleet crossed the outer boundary of what the Council still insisted on calling human-controlled space. Cole was beside me. Priya was on a comm line from the Kalari port, which had been fully operational for 4 months and was handling more traffic than anyone had projected. Director Ford was in my earpiece from Earth. "They are moving," Ford said, "heading for Earth orbit. Estimated arrival 11 days at their current speed." "They will not reach Earth orbit," I said. "Explain that to me," Ford said. "Watch," I said. I turned to the navigation officer, a 24-year-old named Ben Holt, who had the remarkable quality of remaining completely calm under pressure, which made him one of the most valuable people I had ever worked with. "Ben," I said, "begin sequence 1. Ben's hands moved across the navigation array across 6 star systems. Simultaneously, 15 human vessels with operational fold drives vanished from the positions the Council's long-range sensors had been tracking and reappeared elsewhere, not in formation, not in a defensive line, scattered, each one in a location that was genuinely useful and completely unexpected. 2 appeared near a Council resupply depot 3 systems away from where the fleet was heading, not threatening it, simply present, close enough to make the fleet's logistics officers nervous about their supply line. 3 appeared near a cluster of non-Council systems that had been quietly leaning toward the open coalition but had not yet formally committed. Their presence was a reminder: you are not alone in this decision. 4 appeared in void corridors that the fleet would need to transit to maintain its current heading, not blocking them exactly, but positioned such that any fleet commander with reasonable tactical instincts would have to account for them before moving forward. The remaining 6 went somewhere that took the Council's intelligence teams approximately 4 hours to identify and approximately 4 more hours to fully process the implications of. They went to the 17 systems that were currently the Council's largest trade partners, not threatening them, not demanding anything, simply sitting in Open space with their comm channels. Broadcasting the relay networks open. Invitation signal. The message was clear without needing to be stated. You have options. What happened next is something I have tried to describe accurately in my formal reports and have never quite managed, because the mechanics are simple, but the weight of it requires more than mechanics to convey. The Admiral's fleet stopped, not because it was defeated, not because a single shot had been fired, because not a single shot had been fired. It stopped because the Admiral was a genuinely capable commander, and capable commanders recognize when their doctrine has encountered a situation it was not designed for. The Council's military doctrine was built around force concentration, bringing overwhelming strength to a fixed point and applying it. It assumed an enemy that had a capital to defend, fleet to destroy, a supply line to cut. It assumed, in other words, a conventional opponent. We were not conventional. We had no single capital that could be threatened because our essential infrastructure was distributed across 14 void quarter stations, 6 outposts, 1 Kalari port, and the fold drive vessels that could relocate in hours. Cutting our supply lines was meaningless because we had built our network specifically to not depend on any single route. Destroying our fleet was irrelevant because our military strength was never our primary tool. Director Ford had said it to me once, 2 years earlier, when we were arguing about whether to prioritize the drive technology or the diplomatic outreach. Yara, he said, an enemy that does not understand what you are fighting for cannot figure out how to hurt you. The Council thought we were fighting for territory, for rights, for membership, status, for the dignity of being included in their network on fair terms. We were not. We were fighting for a different galaxy. And you cannot send a fleet to destroy a different galaxy. You can only choose whether to be part of it. The Admiral stopped her fleet. She requested a communication channel with Earth Command. Director Ford took the call. I listened to the recording afterward. The Admiral's voice, through translation, was precise and clipped, the way always were, and she asked a single question. What, she said, do you actually want to? Director Ford's answer was even shorter. The same thing we have always wanted. He said, to be left alone to do what we do. And what is it that you do? She asked. We figure things out, he said, and then we share them. That is the entire plan. There is no secret objective underneath it. We are not building an empire. We do not want your territory. We want the right to exist and expand and share what we learn without asking for permission first. If the Council would like to participate in that, we would genuinely welcome it. There was a long pause. And if we do not, she asked, then you will watch, Ford said, while everyone else does. I imagine the Admiral sat with that for a while. 600 warships, the finest in the Council's fleet, against an enemy that had already decided not to play by the rules that made 600 warships meaningful. She had not lost, she had simply arrived at the wrong kind of war. It was on the 9th day, with the fleet still holding position and the diplomatic channels running hot with conversation, that the Council was struggling to manage all at once, that we did the thing that finally, completely and permanently changed the shape of the contest. We broadcast the fold drive schematics, not selectively, not to allies or to species we had already made contact with, to every inhabited system within range of the relay network, which by that point meant most of the known galaxy, every species, every civilization, every developing culture with a receiver capable of picking up the signal in every language our translation capacity could manage, with technical documentation calibrated for a range of technological levels. Any species with basic metallurgy and 20 years of development time could now build a fold drive. The Council's trade lane monopoly had been its central tool of power for 3 centuries. The lanes were fast, they were safe, and they were controlled. Species paid for access, species stayed compliant to keep access. The whole architecture of Council authority rested at its base on the fact that getting from one place to another required going through the Council's approved routes. We had just made the lanes optional. Ben Holt, sitting beside me, watched the broadcast confirmation come through and let out a long breath. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the whole thing." "That's the whole thing," I agreed. The Admiral's fleet turned around on the 12th day. No announcement, no formal withdrawal, no press release. The ships simply began moving back the way they had come. Some of them, I noticed from the sensor reports, were not heading back to Council space at all. They were heading to 3 systems that had recently applied to join the open coalition. Soldiers know sometimes before their governments do. The following morning I got a message from Arbiter Veth. It was brief and for a Vreth unexpectedly direct. "Commander Oshie," it said, "I have been thinking about what you said. I believe we need to talk again. This time I will not be coming alone." I wrote back immediately. "Come whenever you are ready," I said. "The Rift Walker will be here." I set the message down and looked out the forward viewport at the stars. They were unchanged, as stars always are, indifferent to the negotiations happening in the dark between them, but something in the pattern felt different to me now, and I realized after a moment what it was. It was the absence of lines, the routes and zones and approved corridors that had been drawn across this view for my entire life were simply gone. They had never been real. I knew that. Had always known that somewhere underneath the conditioning. But knowing something and feeling it are different experiences, and for the first time standing in the quiet of the bridge with the stars spread in every direction and no map telling me which ones I was allowed to visit, I felt it. The galaxy was open. It had always been open. We had simply stopped letting anyone draw walls across it. 3 years. I want you to understand what 3 years means when measured not in calendar pages, but in distance covered. 3 years ago, I stood in an observer's booth and watched the galaxy vote to exclude my species. Today, I am sitting across a table from the High Arbiter of that same galactic council, and the table is aboard my ship. And he came to me. The room is not large. The Rift Walker was built for speed and function, not ceremony. The table is a standard alloy conference table with 4 chairs on each side, and the chairs on my side are occupied by me, by Priya Amata, by Cole Warren, and by a Kelari diplomat named something that my translation software were rendered as a soft clicking sound. I had started writing as clicker in my notes, but who had asked me several months ago to call her Elay. She had chosen the name herself, she told me, because she liked the sound it made in human mouths. Allah was wearing a gray suit that Priya had helped her select because Allah had asked for guidance on how to dress for a formal council meeting, and Priya had taken the task seriously. She looked calm. She was eating a small nutrient bar from her own culture's food supply quietly, without any particular concern for what anyone at the table thought about it. Across from us, Arbiter Veth flanked by two council officials whose names and species I had reviewed in my briefing notes. Behind them, through the conference room viewport, I could see the transport that had brought them, a council diplomatic vessel, large and formal, bearing the council's insignia. It looked from where I sat slightly smaller than I remembered. Veth opened. "Commander Asa," he said, "the Galactic Council formally requests the resumption of diplomatic relations with Earth and all human-administered territories." I let the sentence sit for a moment. "The Council would also like," he continued, "to offer the lifting of the exclusion order issued 18 months ago, restoration of full membership status, and a formal apology to be delivered in open session for the circumstances that led to the exclusion." I looked at him, he looked at me. Behind him, one of the council officials shifted slightly, which I interpreted as discomfort. "Arbiter Veth," I said, "I appreciate the offer. I want to respond to it honestly, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve diplomacy right now." "I would prefer honesty," he said. "The exclusion order," I said, "has been functionally irrelevant for approximately 14 months. We are not operating in council space. We are operating in the open coalitions network, which now includes 61 species and covers transit corridors that the council does not have jurisdiction over. Lifting the ban would change nothing practical about our situation." Veth nodded slowly. "I am aware. I also want to be honest about membership," I said. "Returning to the council as it currently operates is not something I can recommend to Earth Command, not because we bear any particular anger about what happened 3 years ago, but because the structure of the council as it currently exists is not compatible with the way we have chosen to operate. The hierarchy, the approval processes, the transit monopoly, all of those would require us to function in ways that we have moved past. The transit monopoly," Veth said, "is no longer operational." "No," I said, "it is not, which brings me to what I actually want to say." I folded my hands on the table and looked at him carefully. "We do not want the council to fall," I said. "I want that to be clearly understood. The council has maintained a form of galactic stability for 3 centuries, and the institutional knowledge it carries is genuinely valuable. There are 61 species in the open coalition, and none of them are in a territorial dispute with each other, and part of the reason for that is structures the council built that are worth keeping." "Then what do you want?" Veth said. It was the same question the Admiral had asked 18 months ago through a different channel. "We want the council to reform and join the coalition as an equal member," I said, "not as a governing body, not as a licensing authority, as a participant. The council's vote carries the same weight as any other member species in coalition decisions. No veto power, no exclusive control over transit or trade, no approval processes for species development that are designed to slow down anyone who does not already look like the 5 dominant members. Veth was quiet. You are asking the council, he said, carefully, to dissolve the power structure it was built on. I am asking the council, I said, to evolve past the power structure it was built on. The structure served a purpose 3 centuries ago. It does not serve the same purpose now. The galaxy has changed and the council has not, and that is the source of every problem that led to this table. I paused. The species that cannot make that transition will be left behind, I said. Not harmed, not punished, simply left behind. The way every institution that refuses to change is eventually left behind. That is not a threat, it is a description of how time works. A lab beside me finished her nutrient bar and folded the wrapper with precise, careful movements. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence at the table spoke clearly enough. Veth looked at her for a long moment. I watched him process what it meant that a Kelari, a species his council had classified as non-sentient for 3 centuries, was sitting at a formal diplomatic table, in a suit, having clearly arrived here via her own transit arrangements, representing her own people's interests, with complete authority. I will need to take your proposal back to the council, he said. Of course, I said. I should tell you, he said, that half the council will refuse. There are member species who have built their economies and their political influence around the current structure, and they will not surrender that willingly. I know, I said. And the other half? Cole asked quietly. From beside me. Veth tilted his head. The other half, he said, has been watching the Open Coalition's growth for 18 months and has concluded that the structure they have been clinging to is a ship that is already sinking. They want a way out that preserves their dignity. We can offer that, I said. No humiliation, no public accounting. Straightforward transition. Any species, any former council member that joins the coalition in good faith starts with a clean record. Even the Kreth Val, Veth asked. Kreth Val had commanded the fleet. Even the Kreth Val, I said. Admiral made a decision based on the information and the doctrine she had. When the situation changed, she adapted. I respect that. Veth rose, his limbs folded in a configuration I had not seen before, and I spent a moment consulting my memory of Vreth body language before I found it. It was, I realized, a gesture of genuine respect, not the formal kind exchanged at state functions, the kind that comes from one person recognizing something true about another. You said, he told me, 3 years ago in the council chamber that humanity was calculating. I did, I said. I think, he said, that I underestimated the scale of what you were calculating. Most people do, Priya said pleasantly. From beside me. Veth left, the 2 officials followed. The door closed. The 4 of us sat in the conference room for a moment. The stars were outside the viewport. The Snort's relay network was humming through the ship's communications array. Somewhere right now, a species I had never heard of was receiving the fold drive schematics and beginning to understand what they meant. Somewhere, a Lari ship was making a transit that the council would have taken 60 years to approve. Somewhere, Ben Holt was at a navigation station looking at a star chart with no lanes on it, deciding where to go next. Well, Al-Laf said in the careful, deliberate English she had been practicing for 4 months, I think that Went well. Cole laughed first, then Priya. I. Myself a smile. It did, I said. What happens now? Al asked. I thought about the question. I thought about the red light above the council floor 3 years ago and the arbiter's first quiet question in my earpiece. I thought about 72 hours that the council had handed us thinking they were a deadline and that we had used as a runway. I thought about the relay stations, humming in the void, and the Kalari moon, with its permanent port and the fold drive that had taken 10 years to carefully not finish, and the 43 species who had been waiting for an opening and found one when we stopped pretending the walls were real. Now, I said, we wait for them to decide, and while we wait, we keep building. Elaine nodded seriously. Cole pulled up the navigation display. Priya was already writing notes on her tablet, probably about 3 different things at once. I looked out at the stars. They had called it a ban. They had said it with the confidence of people who had never considered that the thing they were banning might not actually need what they were withholding. They had looked at us for 40 years and seen a species learning to comply, not a species learning everything it needed to know about the structure it was being asked to comply with. They had not understood that every rule they enforced taught us exactly how the rules were built. They had not understood that every door they closed pointed us toward the walls. They had not understood that a species that could fly to the moon on a controlled explosion 4,000 years after its first written word is not a species that responds well to being told to wait. We had waited, we had watched, we had learned. We had built quietly and carefully and with tremendous patience everything we would need for the moment when waiting was no longer required. They had given us that moment themselves. They had voted for it in a chamber full of red light and handed it to us with a 72-hour clock, thinking they were showing us the door. We had walked through it, and on the other side was not the cold, empty exile they had imagined. On the other side was everything we had been preparing: a network without owners, coalition without hierarchy, a galaxy that was finally actually completely open. The council's message came 4 days later. Vet himself delivered it on the same private channel we had used for our first unofficial meeting 18 months ago. And his message was short. 51 council members were applying for open coalition membership. 17 were declining and intended to remain as a reduced independent council. They asked only that the coalition not move to absorb their systems by force. I wrote back immediately. We would never, I said. They are welcome to their space, and when they are ready, the door will still be open. I sent the message and set down the comm unit and looked at the star chart on my wall, the new one, the one with nodes instead of lanes, and thought about what 51 species joining in 4 days actually meant in practical terms. There was a lot of work ahead. There always is when something old ends and something new begins. The coalition would need processes, frameworks, shared understandings, dispute mechanisms that did not simply replicate the hierarchy we had replaced. We would argue and negotiate and get some things wrong and fix them and argue again, because that is what a real community of equals actually looks like. And it is harder and slower and more uncertain than a hierarchy, but it is also, in the ways that matter, indestructible. You cannot destroy a network by cutting its head off, it does not have a head. A last stop by the bridge that evening. She stood beside me at the viewport and looked at the stars, and I wondered what they looked like to her, whether they looked different from a Kalahari perspective, whether the distances felt different to a species that had spent centuries being told they were not significant enough to travel between them. My people have a word, she said after a while. It does not translate well, but the closest thing in English is something like the moment the horizon becomes yours. What does that mean? I asked. It means, she said, the moment you understand that the limit you believed in was not a feature of the world, it was a feature of who was drawing the maps. I looked at her. We have been waiting for our horizon, she said, a long time. How does it feel? I asked. She considered the question with the careful deliberateness that I had come to recognize as characteristic of Harry thought, not slowness but precision, the refusal to answer until the answer was accurate. Large, she said finally, it feels very large. I turned back to the stars. Yes, I said, it does. Outside, the galaxy spread in every direction, unmapped and unhurried, and full of everything we had not yet discovered, and for the first time in the 41 years of my life, none of it was off limits. The lanes were gone. Zones were gone. The color-coded jurisdictions and the approved corridors and the 60-year approval processes and the council's careful self-serving definitions of which species were intelligent enough to matter. All of it was gone, or going, or slowly fading into the kind of history that gets taught in schools as a lesson about what happens when power confuses itself with permanence. The horizon belonged to everyone now. We had made sure of it. And somewhere in the vast, beautiful, open dark, a species that had never been allowed to choose its own direction was pointing at a star and making plans. That is the entire story. That is what the band produced, not surrender, not silence, not the quiet retreat of a species that had been shown its place. A galaxy that finally made sense. We had just needed enough room to build it.